Welcome to this lesson on conditional statements. Make sure you got your math dictionary out. Here comes the first word. Conditional statement. A statement that can be written in the form if P then Q, where there are two things you need to know. P represents the hypothesis, and Q represents the conclusion. So again, we're using our reasoning skills where if said hypothesis happens, then we can conclude something. So for example, we have the statement, if an animal is a robin, then the animal is a bird. It asks, what are the hypothesis and the conclusion of this conditional? Well, an animal is a robin. That is our hypothesis. Then we can conclude that the animal is a bird. Conclusion. So typically, the hypothesis comes right after or if part of a conditional statement, and the conclusion happens right after the then part. The if and the then are usually never included in the hypothesis or the conclusion. If ice appears on the sidewalk, then it must be below 32 degrees outside. Pretty common statement. We live in Minnesota. If there's ice, then it has to be below 32 degrees. So the hypothesis is this part, ice appears on the sidewalk. So if we're walking down the sidewalk in the winter, we see ice on the sidewalk, then it must be below 32 degrees outside. There is the conclusion, double underlined in blue. What if we have one that's not an if-then statement? So here it is. You can play hockey if you know how to skate. Well, our hypothesis is still after the if. So if you know how to skate, so there's our hypothesis, then we can conclude that you can play hockey. So in this case, the conclusion comes at the start. Now, some of these statements you might think have a notion of being true or being false. We can come up with what's called a counterexample. We've worked with counterexamples before. An example that proves a conditional statement is false. Here's our conditional. If you live in Minnesota, then you shovel a sidewalk. What happened there? If you live in Minnesota, then you shovel a sidewalk every year. Now, can you think of an example of a person that lives in Minnesota but maybe doesn't have to shovel a sidewalk every year? What about people that live in condos or apartments? I am one of them. I live in a condo. I never have to shovel a sidewalk during the year. So this conditional is false. And my counterexample is somebody that lives in a condo, or maybe an apartment, or maybe a townhouse where the association shovels it. So just because you live in Minnesota doesn't mean you'd have to shovel a sidewalk every year. You personally. Let's take a look at another one. If you live in Rochester, then you live in New York. So is this true or false? I would say it's false. Because I know of a little town called Rochester, Minnesota. So it says if you live in Rochester, then you live in New York. Well, I know people that live in Rochester and they don't live in New York. They live in Rochester, Minnesota, not Rochester, New York. If you are 16 years old, then you are old enough to drive in the U.S. This is a true conditional. If you're 16, you're old enough to drive by yourself in the United States. How can you write the following statement as a conditional? Vertical angles share a vertex. Well, a conditional statement is an if-then statement. So if we need a hypothesis between vertical angles and share a vertex. Well, if, let's say, we need two angles to be vertical, so let's say if two angles are vertical, then we can conclude that they would share a vertex. So there's an example of writing a conditional statement. We're going to tap into more words here, okay, based on our regular conditional statements. So here is the next word. Have your dictionary out. The converse. It's a statement formed by changing the order of the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement. So it says if Q then P. So remember our conditional was if P then Q. So the converse would be reversing the order. Here's an example. The conditional says if it's raining outside, then you will get wet. The converse, I'll write it in blue here. The converse means we got to switch the order. So if it's raining outside, then you will get wet. That's the conclusion. So if we switch that, we would write it as if you are wet, then it's raining outside. So notice how I didn't just leave it as you will get wet. If you will get wet, then it's raining outside. We still have some grammatical things that we need to address. So we can rephrase it as, well, if you are wet, then it must be raining outside. Next one, the inverse. The inverse is a statement formed by negating a hypothesis and conclusion. So changing what it means. So if not P, then not Q. So if our conditional is if it's raining outside, then you will get wet. The inverse would be if it is not, I'm only writing not in capitals to show you that we're negating it. If it is not raining outside, then you will not get wet. So the inverse, we keep the same order, but we negate it, meaning we say not or some form of not to negate the statement. But we keep the same order. Last word of the lesson here, contrapositive. Statement formed by changing the order and negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. So here's our example. So if our hypothesis is if it's raining outside and our conclusion is then you will get wet, we're going to switch the order and negate it. So the contrapositive, it's basically negating the converse. So if we need to put this you will get wet first, except we need to negate it. So if you do not get wet, then it is not raining outside. So take a look at these examples. If you have more questions, see Mr. Ryan. Otherwise, grab the worksheet and you can get started.